Occupational risk assessment is a critical process that helps organizations identify and mitigate potential hazards and risks in the workplace. The following is a methodology for conducting an occupational risk assessment. Identify hazards. The first step in the risk assessment process is to identify potential hazards in the workplace. This can be done through a variety of methods, such as reviewing incident reports, conducting workplace inspections, or consulting with employees. Assess risks. Once potential hazards have been identified, the next step is to assess the risks associated with each hazard. This involves evaluating the likelihood and potential severity of harm that could result from the hazard. Control risks. Once risks have been identified and assessed, the next step is to develop and implement controls to mitigate those risks. This can involve implementing engineering, administrative, or personal protective equipment controls to reduce the likelihood or severity of harm. Monitor and review. Risk assessments should be reviewed and updated regularly to ensure that controls remain effective and to identify new hazards or risks. This can be done through regular workplace inspections, incident investigations, or employee feedback. Record keeping. Employers should maintain records of the risk assessment process, including hazard identification, risk assessment, and control measures implemented. These records can be used to demonstrate compliance with regulatory requirements and to identify trends or areas for improvement. Risk assessment and risk management are two important concepts in workplace safety, and it's important to understand the difference between them. Risk assessment is the process of identifying potential hazards and evaluating the likelihood and severity of harm that could result from those hazards. This involves analyzing the workplace environment, processes, and procedures to identify potential hazards and assess the level of risk associated with each one. The goal of risk assessment is to identify potential hazards and determine the level of risk associated with each one so that appropriate risk management measures can be put in place. Risk management, on the other hand, involves taking action to reduce or eliminate the risks identified through the risk assessment process. This can include implementing control measures to reduce the likelihood or severity of harm, such as providing training or personal protective equipment, modifying equipment or processes, or instituting administrative controls such as work procedures or policies. Occupational risk assessment typically includes three main components: hazard identification, occupational exposure assessment, and dose-response analysis. Hazard identification. This involves identifying potential hazards in the workplace that could cause harm to workers. Hazards can include physical, chemical, biological, ergonomic, and psychosocial factors. This step involves gathering information about the hazards and their potential effects on workers. Occupational exposure assessment. This step involves assessing the likelihood and extent of exposure to the identified hazards in the workplace. This can include measuring exposure levels through various methods such as air sampling, biological monitoring, or personal monitoring. Dose response analysis. This step involves analyzing the relationship between the level of exposure to the hazard and the potential health effects that could result. This can involve reviewing scientific literature and data to determine the health effects associated with specific levels of exposure to the hazard. These three components work together to provide a comprehensive understanding of the potential risks associated with hazards in the workplace. The information gathered through this process can then be used to develop appropriate control measures to minimize or eliminate the risks to workers. Control measures can include engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. Regular occupational risk assessment is an important component of workplace safety and health and can help to ensure that workers are protected from potential hazards in the workplace. Safety hazards, biological hazards, physical hazards, ergonomic hazards, and chemical hazards are all potential types of hazards that can exist in the workplace. Safety hazards. These are hazards that can cause physical harm to workers, such as slips, trips, falls, cuts, or burns. Examples of safety hazards in the workplace can include poorly maintained equipment, electrical hazards, or unguarded machinery. Biological hazards. These are hazards that can cause harm to workers through exposure to biological agents such as viruses, bacteria, or fungi. Examples of biological hazards in the workplace can include exposure to blood-borne pathogens such as HIV or hepatitis, or exposure to mold or other allergens. Physical hazards. These are hazards that can cause harm to workers through exposure to physical factors such as noise, vibration, radiation, or extreme temperatures. Examples of physical hazards in the workplace can include exposure to loud machinery, working in extreme heat or cold, or exposure to ionizing radiation. Ergonomic hazards. These are hazards that can cause harm to workers through repetitive or awkward motions, poor posture, or other ergonomic factors. Examples of ergonomic hazards in the workplace can include lifting heavy objects, working at poorly designed workstations, or performing repetitive tasks. Chemical hazards. These are hazards that can cause harm to workers through exposure to chemical agents such as gases, liquids, or solids. Examples of chemical hazards in the workplace can include exposure to hazardous chemicals such as solvents, acids, or pesticides. Employers have a responsibility to identify and assess these types of hazards in the workplace and to implement appropriate control measures to minimize or eliminate the risks to workers. This can include providing appropriate personal protective equipment, modifying work processes or procedures, or implementing engineering controls to minimize exposure to hazards.